Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. Have you ever done everything right? Showed up every day, followed every rule, built something real and solid out of years of discipline and quiet sacrifice, and then watched it get taken from you? Not slowly, but in a single morning, in front of everyone, for something so small it borders on absurd? Because I have. And what I'm about to tell you is not a story about a woman who fell apart. This is a story about what happens when you don't. My name is Olivia Hendricks. I was a senior compliance auditor for 9 years. And I was fired, publicly, humiliatingly, with my photograph attached, for leaving work 2 minutes early. 2 minutes. After almost a decade of spotless performance. After years of building a professional reputation I believed was untouchable. I couldn't believe it was happening. I stood there in that open office, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, and I understood, in the most visceral, devastating way, what it means to be shamed in front of the people you worked alongside for nearly a decade. Here's what they didn't know. Here's the secret that Patrice and HR and everyone who received that email with my photo never considered. Not even for a second. I keep records. Every document, every timestamp, every compliance log, years of meticulous, color-coded, cross-referenced truth. And somewhere inside those files was a detail. One single, quiet, almost invisible detail that would trigger something none of us could stop. Not me, not them, not anyone. I didn't call a lawyer that night. I didn't post anything online. I didn't send a furious email that they could screenshot and use against me. I made tea. I opened my files. And I found something that shouldn't have existed, a federal submission made under my credentials, 3 days after I had been fired. 3 days after I no longer existed, as far as Morrow and Calloway was concerned. And what happened next? What the system did with that single piece of information? Automatically, silently, without any instruction from me, is the part of this story that I need you to hear. Because this isn't really a story about revenge. It's a story about what happens when truth meets silence and patience. It's about the kind of justice that doesn't need you to fight for it, only to protect the evidence long enough for the right people to find it. It's about dignity, about self-worth, about what you discover about yourself when an institution that you trusted decides to betray you, publicly, callously, completely, and you choose, against every instinct, not to react. It's about what I lost, what they lost, and what I built from the rubble of a Tuesday morning that was supposed to destroy me. They thought firing me was the end of the story. They were wrong. It was the beginning. And then, it actually happened. I was standing there in the middle of that open-floor office, holding my bag with every single pair of eyes locked on me. And I felt the kind of shame that doesn't just sting, it burns straight through you. Everything I had built over almost a decade, perfect attendance, spotless records, never a single complaint filed against me, gone in less than 10 minutes. The HR director, a woman named Patrice, didn't even have the decency to call me into a private room. She walked right up to my desk on a Tuesday morning in front of my entire department and told me I was being let go. The reason? I had clocked out 2 minutes early on a Friday. 2 minutes, after staying 40 minutes past my scheduled time the week before without a single cent of overtime. I felt my face go hot, not from anger, not yet, but from the pure, raw humiliation of being treated like I was nothing. Like all those years of consistency meant absolutely nothing. What happened next was the part that made my stomach drop. Before I could even process what was being said to me, Patrice had already sent an email, company-wide, with my full name, my photo from the employee directory, and a brief notice of termination for violation of attendance policy. I couldn't believe it. 412 employees received that email. 412 people who would now forever associate my name with misconduct. That's not discipline. That's a public execution. and I was the one on the chopping block. I remember walking to my car feeling like the ground beneath me was made of something unstable, like everything I had built was just crumbling. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. I had trusted that place. I had defended it in conversations with friends who warned me about toxic corporate culture. I had told people, no, Morrow and Callaway is different. And standing in that parking lot, I realized I had been lying to myself for years. The truth had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to see it. But here's the thing about me, and this is something Patrice clearly didn't account for. I don't fall apart in public. I never have. I sat in my car, took 3 slow breaths, and made a decision right then and there. I was not going to cry, I was not going to post anything online, and I was absolutely not going to call anyone from that office begging for answers. Instead, I was going to go home, make a strong cup of tea, and open every single file I had ever kept from my years at that company. Because a woman like me, I keep receipts, every single one. What I found when I opened those files that evening, let's just say that the moment I saw it, I knew this story was far from over. There was something in those records, something small, something that most people would have missed entirely. And it was about to change everything. Let me paint you a picture of what Morrow and Callaway Financial Group actually looked like from the inside. Because from the outside, it was all glass windows, polished marble lobbies, and LinkedIn posts about company culture and employee well-being. They won a Regional Employer Award 2 years in a row. 2 years in a row. And every time I saw that plaque hanging in the lobby, I felt something between admiration and unease. Because the place I walked into every morning looked nothing like the place they described in those press releases. The rules at Morrow and Callaway weren't guidelines, they were weapons. And the people who wielded them weren't managers in the traditional sense. They were gatekeepers with performance quotas tied to how many disciplinary actions they could document in a quarter. I'm not exaggerating. I once watched a colleague, a man who had been with the company for 12 years, receive a formal written warning because he used the wrong font in an internal memo. 12 years, and they backstabbed him over a font. That's the kind of place this was. And the scariest part? Most of us had been conditioned to think it was normal. The policies existed in layers. There was the employee handbook you received on your first day, and then there was the real handbook, the unwritten one, the one you learned through quiet conversations in bathroom breaks and parking lot whispers. Things like, never question a decision made by HR in writing because they will use that email against you. Never leave before your direct supervisor, even if your shift technically ended an hour ago. And under no circumstances should you ever file a formal grievance. Because what happens to employees who file grievances at Morrow and Callaway is something people didn't talk about loudly, but everyone understood. They disappeared, quietly, with a mutual agreement clause attached. What's deeply disturbing, and this is the part that kept me up at night long before I was ever fired, is that this system had been allowed to exist because it was dressed up in the language of accountability. We hold our people to the highest standards. We believe in structure and discipline, beautiful phrases, but when you stripped away the corporate vocabulary, what you were really looking at was a culture built on fear, on compliance through intimidation, and on the silent agreement that your dignity was a fair price to pay for a steady paycheck. I had paid that price for years, and I had never once stopped to ask myself if it was worth it. The day I was fired was the day I finally saw it clearly, all of it, without the filters I had spent so long carefully putting in place. And I want you to understand, the family you build at work, the trust you give to an institution, the years of loyalty you offer up, when a company decides to betray all of that for the sake of a 2-minute policy violation, what you're left with isn't just anger. It's grief. Real, deep, family-level grief. And underneath that grief, if you're paying attention, is something far more powerful. Clarity. Because clarity is dangerous. Clarity is what happens when the noise finally stops and you see the machinery for exactly what it is. And I had never been more clear-eyed in my entire life than I was sitting at my kitchen table that night, with those files open in front of me, realizing that the system that had just tried to destroy me had made a mistake. There is a very specific kind of calm that settles over you when you realize the emotional reaction is exactly what they're counting on. I had seen it happen to others, good people, talented people, who made the mistake of reacting publicly, of posting on social media, of sending that one furious email they would later regret. And every single time, without exception, the company would use that reaction as evidence. See? See how unstable she is? That's why we let her go. I had watched that playbook run too many times to fall for it myself, so I didn't. I chose silence. Strategic, deliberate, ice-cold silence. That first night, after I had let myself feel the weight of everything, the humiliation, the betrayal, the sheer injustice of it all, I made myself a second cup of tea, and I sat down in front of my laptop with a notepad beside me. I am, by training and by nature, a compliance professional. That means I think in systems. I think in documentation, in audit trails, in data integrity. And one of the things I had done throughout my career, not because I expected something like this, but because professionalism is a habit, was keep meticulous personal copies of every compliance-related document I had ever worked on or been named in. Every log entry, every timestamp, every submission. The files were organized by quarter, color-coded, cross-referenced. I know how that sounds. My best friend used to laugh at me for it. "Olivia, you keep more records than the IRS," she'd say. But sitting there that night, going through those folders one by one, I wasn't laughing. I was focused. Completely, surgically focused. Because somewhere in that mountain of documentation was the truth. Not my version of it, not Patrice's version of it. The actual, verifiable, time-stamped truth of what had happened and how I had conducted myself throughout my entire tenure at that company. What I was looking for initially wasn't anything dramatic. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was simply trying to build a clear, coherent record that I could present to an employment attorney. Because that was the plan. File a wrongful termination claim, document the hostile work environment, and pursue whatever remedies the law provided. That was it. That was the entirety of my strategy at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Measured, proportional, dignified. I was going to reclaim what they had taken from me through the proper channels, and I was going to do it with my head held high. But then I opened a specific folder, the one labeled Federal Regulatory Submissions, Q3, Q4, and something stopped me cold. A timestamp. A single, quiet, almost easy-to-miss timestamp attached to a document submission that had been filed using my employee credentials. A submission made 3 days after my termination, and I sat very still because I understood immediately, in the way that only someone who has spent years working in compliance can understand, exactly what that meant. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. I just looked at it and I thought, there it is. I didn't do anything with it that night. I just saved it, backed it up in 3 separate places, closed my laptop, and went to sleep. Because some discoveries are too important to act on impulsively. This wasn't about revenge, not yet, not consciously. It was about something much quieter, the truth, finally deciding to show itself. In compliance work, there's a term we use, credential misuse. And it sounds almost mundane until you understand what it means in a federal context. It means that someone, somewhere, used a person's authorized identity to file an official document with a government body, not a company memo, not an internal report, an official federal submission. And in the United States, that isn't just an HR problem. It isn't just grounds for a lawsuit. It is, by definition, a federal offense. 3 days after my termination had been officially processed, a filing had been submitted under my name and my access credentials. Morrow and Calloway hadn't just fired me unfairly. They had, in the act of covering their own administrative sloppiness, committed a crime. Let me explain exactly what had happened, because the details matter here. As part of my role in compliance, I had been the named responsible party on several federal contract documentation packages, the kind of filings that go directly to regulatory oversight bodies and are tied to government funding streams. When I was terminated, the proper procedure would have been to reassign those credentials, close out my access within 24 hours, and ensure any pending submissions were either held or filed under new authorized credentials. It's not complicated. It's literally Compliance 101. But Morrow and Calloway, in their rush to humiliate me and move on, had failed to do any of that. And so, 3 days later, when a deadline hit, someone in that office, presumably someone in HR or contract management, had simply logged into the system using my still active credentials and submitted the filing as if I were still employed, as if I had authorized it, as if the termination had never happened. I couldn't believe the carelessness. I genuinely couldn't. These were the same people who fired me over 2 minutes. The same people who sent a company-wide email with my photograph attached to destroy my professional reputation. And yet they couldn't be bothered to follow the most basic credentialing protocols required by federal law. The irony was almost too sharp to process. They had weaponized their own rulebook against me, and then completely failed to follow the rules that actually mattered, the rules with federal teeth. Here's what made it even more significant. Because these were federal contract filings, there were automated monitoring systems on the government side, systems specifically designed to detect anomalies like this. A terminated employee's credentials being used to submit a compliance document after the termination date? That's exactly the kind of irregularity those systems are built to catch. It doesn't require anyone to call anyone. It doesn't require a complaint to be filed. The system simply detects the anomaly, flags it, and routes it for review. Automatically, silently, inevitably. And that's the part I want you to really sit with for a moment, because it's the part that changed everything about how I understood what was unfolding. I didn't trigger anything. I didn't make a phone call. I didn't forward documents to an agency or write a whistleblower letter. I just found the information. And the information, by its very existence, had already set something in motion that neither I nor Morrow and Calloway could stop. Karma, in this case, didn't need my help. The machine had already started moving. I backed up those files one more time. I wrote down the exact document ID, the exact timestamp, the exact credential log, and then I sat back in my chair and let myself feel, just for one brief moment, the deep, quiet satisfaction of a woman who has just realized that the truth is on her side. Not because she fought for it, but because she simply refused to let it be buried. I want you to imagine standing on the shore, watching a wave that you know is coming, a wave you can see building on the horizon, slow and inevitable and enormous, while everyone else around you is still staring at their phones. That is exactly what the next 2 weeks felt like for me. I knew something was coming. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before it arrives, not in the air, but in your bones. And the people at Morrow and Calloway? They had absolutely no idea. About 12 days after my termination, I went about those days quietly. I updated my resume, had coffee with a former colleague who'd left the company 6 months earlier, and spent 2 evenings consulting with an employment attorney about the wrongful termination. I didn't mention the credential issue, not yet. My attorney was building one case. I was watching another one build entirely on its own. Because by that point, I had done enough research to understand the timeline of federal audit processes, and I knew that if the automated system had flagged the irregularity, which, given the nature of the filing, it almost certainly had, then the wheels were already turning somewhere inside a government office I had never set foot in. Then on a Thursday morning, Nearly 2 weeks after everything began, I received an email. It wasn't from Morrow and Calloway. It wasn't from my attorney. It was from the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, addressed to me by name, referencing the specific contract documentation package I had been the named party on, and informing me that a routine audit review had been initiated following the detection of a credentialing anomaly in a recent submission. They weren't accusing me. They weren't even implying I had done anything wrong. They were simply notifying me as the named compliance officer that the audit had been triggered and that they may be in contact for further information. Formal, professional, completely routine in tone, and absolutely devastating in its implications for Morrow and Calloway. I read that email 4 times, then I forwarded it to my attorney. I remember she called me within 20 minutes and her first words were, "Olivia, where did this come from?" And I told her, "I didn't do anything. I just kept my records." And the system did the rest. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then she said very quietly, "They have no idea what's about to hit them, do they?" I told her, "Not even a little bit." What I felt in that moment wasn't triumph, not exactly. It was something more layered than that. It was the feeling of years of loyalty, of dignity, of self-worth quietly asserting themselves after being publicly thrown in the trash. It was the feeling of knowing that the truth doesn't require a champion. It just requires space to exist. And I had given it that space by staying calm, by keeping my records, by refusing to let them reduce me to an emotional reaction they could dismiss. The justice that was coming wasn't something I had manufactured. It was something I had refused to prevent. And that distinction mattered more to me than I can properly express. Somewhere across the city, in a glass-walled boardroom I would never enter again, someone was about to read something very uncomfortable. And I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking tea, watching the horizon, and waiting for the wave to land. I wasn't in the room when it happened, obviously, but I heard about it afterward in ways that painted the picture so clearly it might as well have been a film I'd watched from the front row. The federal compliance officer arrived at Morrow and Calloway on a Monday morning, roughly 3 weeks after my termination, not with fanfare, not with a fleet of government vehicles. Just one woman, mid-50s, in a gray suit, carrying a briefcase and a badge. She asked for the Director of Human Resources and the Chief Compliance Officer simultaneously. And the moment those 2 people walked into the conference room and saw her sitting there, something shifted in the building. People felt it without knowing what it was. That particular kind of institutional dread that runs through an office when the air changes. What happened in that meeting, from what I've been told by someone who was peripherally involved in the administrative side of things, was a masterclass in exposure. The federal officer laid out, calmly and methodically, the anomaly that had been detected. The submission of a federal contract compliance filing using the credentials of a terminated employee, 3 days post-termination. She presented the timestamps. She referenced the applicable federal statutes. And she asked, with the practiced neutrality of someone who has had this exact conversation many times before, for an explanation. The HR director, Patrice, apparently tried to frame it as an administrative oversight, a clerical error. The officer reportedly did not blink, because in federal compliance, clerical error is not a legal defense, not when the error involves misrepresentation in a government filing. Here is what I think is the most devastating part of that meeting, and this is the thing that speaks to something much deeper than just corporate negligence. The people in that room had genuinely believed, I think, that firing me was the end of the story. They thought they had exercised their power, made an example of me, and moved on. They thought the narrative was closed. And sitting across from a federal officer with a file folder full of their own mistakes, they realized, perhaps for the first time, that the story had never been about me at all. It had always been about them, their processes, their choices, their systematic disregard for the very compliance standards they had used to justify destroying my career. The panic that followed, and I'm told it was real, visible, undeniable panic, is the kind of thing that happens when powerful people suddenly realize they are not, in fact, untouchable. Emails were being sent. Lawyers were being called. Executive leadership, who had apparently not been looped in on the specifics of my termination or the subsequent filing error, were now receiving information that made their blood run cold. Because this wasn't just a disgruntled former employee making noise. This was a federal audit, with documentation, with timestamps, with their own actions on record in black and white, filed with a government body that does not accept "we didn't mean to" as a satisfactory response. And I was at a coffee shop near my apartment, going over consulting business plans on my laptop, when my attorney sent me a text that said simply, "The audit is confirmed. Full scope. They're in full panic mode. Call me when you can." I looked at that message for a long moment. Then I ordered another coffee. Because vengeance, real vengeance, the kind that actually means something, doesn't need you to be in the room. It just needs the truth to be undeniable. And the truth at that point was more undeniable than anything Patrice or anyone else at Morrow and Calloway could have prepared for. There's a particular kind of collapse that happens to institutions when the thing they were built to prevent becomes the very thing they caused. It's not loud, not at first. It's quiet, bureaucratic, and absolutely merciless. What Morrow and Calloway began experiencing in the weeks following the federal officer's visit was exactly that kind of collapse. The kind that starts with a single thread being pulled and ends with an entire structure unraveling in front of people who had been convinced, right up until that moment, that it was indestructible. The first concrete consequence was the suspension of 2 major federal contract renewals. Contracts that represented, I later found out, roughly 30% of the firm's annual revenue. They weren't terminated outright, not initially. They were placed under review pending the resolution of the audit. But under review, in the language of federal contracting, carries a weight that anyone in the industry understands immediately. It means uncertainty. It means that partner agencies start asking questions. It means that the reputation you spent years building in front of government clients begins to crack in ways that press releases cannot repair. The internal chaos, by all accounts, was severe. I received messages from former colleagues, people who had watched my termination in silence, people who had seen that email with my photo and said nothing, people who had been too afraid of the system to defend me. And they were reaching out now, cautiously, in hushed tones, to tell me what was happening behind those glass walls. Leadership was fractured. HR was being investigated internally. The chief compliance officer had reportedly retained personal legal counsel, a detail that tells you everything you need to know about how people respond when institutional loyalty stops being a protection and starts being a liability. Everyone was trying to build distance from the decision that had started this. Everyone was pointing at someone else. What struck me most, listening to all of this, wasn't satisfaction. It was something closer to sadness. Because what I was hearing was the story of an institution destroying itself. Not because of me. Not because of anything I had done. But because of the culture they had cultivated for years. The culture of fear, of policy weaponization, of treating employees as expendable parts in a machine. And that culture had finally turned inward. The thing about building a system designed to punish people without mercy is that eventually the system doesn't distinguish between who it was built to protect and who it was built to punish. It just keeps running. It just keeps finding violations. And when the violations belong to the people who designed the system, the machine doesn't care. I thought about the people who had stayed, the ones still sitting at those desks, watching leadership scramble, watching the federal process grind forward with its slow, implacable momentum. I thought about everything I had given to that place, the loyalty, the precision, the dignity I had tried to maintain even when the environment made it difficult. And I thought, this is what happens when a company mistakes cruelty for strength. When a company confuses control with leadership. when the people at the top believe that humiliating someone publicly is an act of authority rather than an act of fear. They had shamed me in front of 400 colleagues, and now the federal government was returning the favor, not for me, but for the integrity of the systems they had pledged to uphold. The authority that Patrice and her department had wielded over me, over all of us, had not disappeared, but it had been fundamentally, irreversibly repositioned. And somewhere in the rubble of that repositioning, the question of who had actually been powerful all along was beginning to answer itself. One of the cruelest things they tried to do, and I have to give Morrow and Calloway credit for audacity, if nothing else, was attempt to reframe the entire situation as something I had engineered. I was told, through my attorney, that during the initial stages of the federal inquiry, HR had submitted a narrative suggesting that the credentialing anomaly might have been a deliberate act on my part, that perhaps I had retained unauthorized access to company systems after my termination and used it to manufacture evidence of misconduct. I read that claim, and I sat with it for a long moment, because that is what desperation looks like when it wears a suit and carries a legal brief. That is what it looks like when people who have done something genuinely wrong try to reroute the story toward the person they wronged. But here is the thing about fabricated narratives. They require the absence of counterfactual evidence to survive. And in this case, there was no absence of evidence. There was, in fact, an abundance of it. My personal compliance records showed, with perfect chronological clarity, every document I had accessed, every submission I had made, every log entry associated with my credentials during my tenure. My access had been active, through no action of my own, beyond my termination date, because Morrow and Calloway had failed to deactivate it. The submission had been made from an internal IP address registered to the company's own network, and the metadata on the filing itself contained information that could only have been input by someone with access to internal contract management systems that I, as a terminated employee, had no physical or remote access to. The federal investigators, to their considerable credit, did not need me to make this case. The audit logs made it themselves. I had not submitted that document. I had not been on that network. I had not, as their narrative tried to suggest, done anything other than exist as a convenient scapegoat for a mistake their own team had made. And the investigators, who deal in evidence rather than in corporate narrative, found this to be almost embarrassingly clear. My attorney told me that when the company's legal team presented their theory of my involvement, the federal officer reviewing the case reportedly paused, looked at the documentation, and asked, with what I imagine was a completely neutral expression, whether they would like to reconsider that position before it became part of the formal record. They reconsidered, quietly, and the internal audit logs that had been submitted as part of the review process became, instead, a definitive record of exactly what had happened and who was responsible. The same meticulous timestamps, the same access records, the same data trail that Morrow and Calloway used as infrastructure for their own compliance operations was now functioning as irrefutable evidence of their own wrongdoing. They had been betrayed by their own systems, their own records, their own culture of documentation turned against them with the same unblinking precision they had once used to document my 2-minute departure. This is the part of the story I want people to really hear, because it's not about me being clever, and it's not about the company being stupid. It's about something much more fundamental. The truth doesn't require your help. If you have lived and worked with integrity, if you have kept your records clean and your conduct above reproach, the truth will eventually find a way to assert itself. You don't have to fight for it. You don't have to perform for it. You just have to not bury it. And I had never buried mine. The narrative reversal was complete. And Patrice, the woman who had walked up to my desk in front of 400 colleagues and announced my termination for a 2-minute discrepancy, was now, I was told, consulting with a personal attorney about her own potential liability. I didn't feel joy about that. I felt something I can only describe as the strange, heavy peace of a woman who has finally been told by every system and institution involved that she was right all along. The story broke on a Wednesday, about 5 weeks after my termination. I know this because I was in the middle of a phone call with my mother, who had been worried sick about me since everything began, when 3 different people texted me within the span of about 4 minutes. The local business press had gotten hold of details about the federal audit through a public records request, and by midday, Morrow and Calloway's name was attached to language like federal investigation and contract compliance violations in headlines across regional financial news outlets. By Thursday evening, it had been picked up by 2 national publications. By Friday, it was being shared in LinkedIn comment sections across the compliance and financial services industries. The exact communities where Morrow and Calloway had spent years carefully cultivating their reputation as an employer of excellence. The irony, of course, was exquisite. The same company that had sent a company-wide email with my photograph to ensure that every single person in their network associated my name with misconduct was now having their own name associated with misconduct in every corner of the professional world they cared about most. The PR team issued a statement, of course, something carefully worded about cooperating fully with regulatory inquiries and remaining committed to the highest standards of compliance. I read it once, and then I read it again, and I thought about Patrice and her announcement in the middle of the open floor. I thought about the 412 people who received that email, and I thought, this is what exposure actually looks like, not a company-wide email. Former clients began asking questions. Industry partners distanced themselves. 2 executives who had been named in connection with the compliance failures, neither of whom had anything to do with my specific termination, but who were now caught in the broader scrutiny that a federal audit generates, resigned within 10 days of the story breaking. The culture of impunity that had allowed Morrow and Calloway to operate the way it did, the culture that had made Patrice feel comfortable walking up to my desk in front of everyone, the culture that had produced that email, the culture that had made all of us feel like our dignity was negotiable, was being publicly examined for the first time. And it did not hold up well under examination. I stayed off social media through all of it. I had made that decision early, and I kept it. My attorney handled any press inquiries that came our way, and they were brief and professional. I didn't want to be part of the noise. I had never wanted that. What I wanted, what I had always wanted from the moment I sat in that parking lot and took those 3 breaths, was the truth to simply be seen. Not amplified, not weaponized, just seen. And as I watched the coverage spread, as I watched an institution that had spent years perfecting the art of controlling narratives lose control of the most important one, I realized that the truth had been seen, completely, unmistakably, and without me having to raise my voice once. But even as the external storm raged, something else was quietly taking shape. Something I had been building in the background during all of those weeks of silence and strategic patience. Something that had nothing to do with Morrow and Calloway, and everything to do with who I intended to become on the other side of all of this. The damage they had done to my name was real. I won't pretend otherwise. But damage, I was learning, is not the same as destruction. And the difference between those 2 things was entirely up to me. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 6 weeks after everything began. It came in a standard government envelope. No decorative letterhead, no dramatic presentation, just a clean, official document from the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, addressed to Olivia Hendricks, former senior compliance auditor. I opened it at my kitchen table, the same table where I had opened those files the night I was fired, the same table where I had backed up my records in 3 places, the same table where I had drunk tea and waited for the wave to land. And I read it slowly, the way you read something you need to fully absorb. The letter acknowledged the conclusion of the preliminary phase of the audit. It confirmed, formally and officially, that the credentialing anomaly had been attributed entirely to Morrow and Calloway's internal failure to follow proper termination protocols. It confirmed that my own records and conduct throughout my tenure were fully consistent with regulatory requirements, that there was no evidence of any misconduct, error, or violation associated with my name or my work. And then, and this is the part I had to read 3 times, it included a personal note from the senior auditor overseeing the case, expressing that my meticulous record-keeping had been, in her words, an example of exactly the kind of professional integrity their office was designed to protect. She asked if I would be open to a conversation about independent consulting work. I set the letter down on the table. I looked out the window, and I cried. Not from sadness, not from relief exactly, but from something I can only describe as the full-body experience of your self-worth being handed back to you by an authority that had no obligation to do so. I had been told, in front of 400 colleagues with my photograph attached, that I was someone whose departure needed to be announced, that I was someone to be made an example of. And now a federal agency was telling me, in writing, on official letterhead, that I was someone worth protecting. That distinction, that complete reversal of narrative, landed somewhere very deep. I called my attorney, I called my mother, I called my best friend, the one who used to tease me about my filing system, and she laughed until she cried and said, "I am never making fun of your folders again." And then I made tea, because some moments deserve to be honored quietly. Some vindications are too significant for celebration to adequately contain. This was one of them. Not because I had won something, I had never framed this as a competition, but because the truth had been formally, officially, irreversibly acknowledged. Not by a judge, not by a jury. By the very regulatory framework that Morrow and Calloway had claimed, for years, to be the gold standard of upholding. The consulting conversation that followed was brief, professional, and opened a door I had never considered walking through. Independent compliance work, reviewing, advising, and auditing organizations on a contract basis, was something I had the qualifications for but had never pursued, because I had always assumed I needed the institutional backing of a firm like Morrow and Calloway to give my expertise credibility. That assumption, I was realizing, had been one of the subtler ways the company had kept people like me contained. The credibility was never theirs to grant. It had always been mine. I had just been too accustomed to asking permission for things I already owned. I registered the business on a Friday afternoon, roughly 7 weeks after being fired. Hendricks Compliance Advisory, a name that was simple, direct, and entirely mine. No committee approval required, no HR sign-off, no corporate branding guidelines to navigate, just my name, my expertise, and a clean slate that felt nothing like a beginning and everything like a reclaiming. Because that's the word I kept coming back to. Reclaiming. Not rebuilding, not starting over. Reclaiming. Taking back something that had always belonged to me and that I had for years been quietly handing over in exchange for a salary and the illusion of security. The first months were lean. I won't romanticize it. Building a client base from scratch, even with strong credentials and the quiet endorsement of a federal agency, takes time. There were weeks where the work was slower than I would have liked, and nights where the old anxiety crept in and asked whether I had made the right decision. But here is what I noticed during those quiet moments. The anxiety felt different now. Before, during my time at Morrow and Calloway, the anxiety I carried was the anxiety of someone who was afraid of losing something. Now it was the anxiety of someone building something. And those two feelings, while they can look identical from the outside, are fundamentally different on the inside. One shrinks you. The other stretches you. Within 8 months, I had 3 retainer clients, 2 mid-size financial firms, and a regional healthcare provider, each paying me more per month than Morrow and Calloway had paid me annually for the last 3 years of my employment. I set my own hours. I chose my own engagements. I declined 2 potential clients whose internal cultures reminded me, in tone and in structure, of the environment I had left, because I had learned, finally and completely, that no contract is worth your dignity. That is not a lesson they teach you in business school. It is a lesson that costs you something real to learn, and I had paid for it in full. The thing about reclaiming your professional identity after it's been publicly dismantled is that the rebuilt version is fundamentally stronger than the original. Not because the humiliation was good for you, but because surviving it requires you to figure out, with great precision and no room for self-deception, exactly who you are when no institution is defining you. I knew who Olivia Hendricks was when she had the title and the office and the company email signature. I now knew who Olivia Hendricks was when she had none of those things. And the second version, the one forged in that parking lot, at that kitchen table, in those weeks of silence and record-keeping and strategic patience, was someone I trusted in a way I had never trusted the first. I still have the letter from the Federal Compliance Office. It's framed, not in my office. I keep it at home, in a room that no client ever sees. Because it's not a trophy. It's a reminder. A reminder that integrity is not a performance you put on for an audience. It's a discipline you maintain when no one is watching, when there's no reward attached, when the system is working against you and not for you. It's what you do with your records at 11:47 p.m. when you've just been publicly fired and you could very easily fall apart. I didn't fall apart, and everything that followed was built on that choice. There are nights, fewer now, but still, when I think about that Tuesday morning, about standing at my desk with my bag in my hand while Patrice made her announcement, about the way the room went quiet, the way people suddenly found reasons to look at their screens, the way the silence itself felt like a kind of complicity. I think about the email, about my photograph being delivered to 412 inboxes attached to the word terminated. And I wait, every time I think about it, for the anger to rise. But it doesn't anymore. What rises instead is something I didn't expect to feel when all of this began. Something that took a long time to arrive, and once it did, settled in with the quiet permanence of something true. Gratitude. Not for the betrayal. I will never romanticize what they did, and I will not pretend it didn't cause real damage, but for the clarity it forced. For the years of record-keeping I had maintained, not out of distrust, but out of professionalism, finally meaning something beyond the ordinary. For the way silence, deployed at exactly the right moment, turned out to be more powerful than any argument I could have made in that parking lot. For the federal letter on my wall. For my business. For the discovery that my self-worth had never actually been in their possession. Only my attention had been. The justice that came for Morrow and Calloway was not the justice of a dramatic courtroom moment. There was no single scene, no climactic confrontation, no moment where I stood in a doorway and delivered a line that made everyone finally understand. Real justice, the kind that lasts, is quieter than that. It's a federal audit proceeding forward on its own momentum, its contracts suspended, its executives issuing careful statements. It's a culture of impunity being exposed, slowly and thoroughly, by the very documentation it had relied on to maintain control. It's karma running its full course without needing a conductor. And I was not the conductor. I was simply the woman who refused to destroy the evidence, the woman who sat at her kitchen table, kept her records, chose silence over spectacle, and trusted, in the deepest and most essential way, that the truth did not need to be forced, only protected. The vengeance was never mine to deliver. The payback was never mine to orchestrate. The system, the same system that had been used to humiliate me, had simply done what systems built on integrity always do when confronted with violations of that integrity. It corrected itself, and the correction was thorough and public and complete. I don't think about Patrice very often. When I do, I don't feel anger, and I don't feel triumph. I feel something closer to pity, the genuine, non-condescending kind, for a person who mistook cruelty for competence and never understood that the 2-minute rule she enforced so publicly was never really about me at all. It was about the fear that lives at the center of every institution that has forgotten the difference between power and control. They had the control. They had always had the control. But the power, the quiet, undeniable, federally validated power of a woman who simply did her job with integrity and kept her records clean, that had always been mine. I know that now. I knew it, I think, even in that parking lot. And every morning I sit down at my desk, in my office, in my business, on my terms. I feel it again. Not as a memory, as a fact. So here we are, on the other side of a Tuesday morning that was designed to end me, and instead became the foundation for everything I am now. If you've made it this far, I think you already know why this story resonated with you. Because injustice doesn't feel abstract when you've lived it. Betrayal doesn't feel theoretical when it comes from somewhere you trusted. And the quiet, relentless satisfaction of watching the truth assert itself. Without theatrics, without revenge, without you having to lower yourself to their level. That feels real in a way that very few things do. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been backstabbed by a job? Or worse, by people you considered your work family? Have you ever been humiliated publicly and had to decide in real time whether to react or to wait? Have you ever been in a room where the system was used against you by the very people who were supposed to protect you? Drop it in the comments. Your story matters. Your experience matters. And honestly, some of the most powerful things I've ever read have come from people in comment sections who were just brave enough to say, "This happened to me too." And if you've ever stayed silent when you wanted to scream, if you've ever chosen dignity over drama and wondered, late at night, whether you made the right call, I want you to know, you did. The truth doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs to be protected. Tell me, what would you have done in my position? Would you have stayed silent or would you have gone to war? There's no wrong answer. I genuinely want to know. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think about your own workplace, your own sense of self-worth, your own relationship with justice and karma, then please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because what we explore here goes far beyond revenge stories and corporate drama. We go deep into the psychology of betrayal, the architecture of institutional injustice, and the real, complicated, deeply human process of reclaiming yourself when the world has tried to define you by your worst moment. Every week, we go places that most content won't, because the people watching deserve more than the surface. You deserve the truth. And we are just getting started.